Good afternoon. This is ThinkTech Hawaii Biz Ed Spotlight. My name is Alice Li Hagen. Welcome to our show today. Punahou School just recently had its 5th annual Brain Symposium. And my guest today is Mike Walker, the junior school principal at Punahou School. He's been there for the past 15 years. Mike is also finishing his doctorate in education at the University of Hawaii. He has written a few articles on brain research and innovative approaches to teaching. Welcome, Mike. It's great to have you on the show today. I read about an article in the Honolulu Advertiser a month ago about muscular mind. That was intriguing, and after I read that article, I said, I've got to find out what that was about, and that's how I contacted Punahou School, and you decided to come to this interview. What is the Brain Symposium?
We started several years ago. This is our 5th Brain Symposium, and like a lot of ideas, it started out as a modest endeavor and has grown significantly, and we've been very happy with it. So actually the genesis of it came is over 10 years ago, I was at the National Association of Independent Schools annual conference, and I went to a presentation by a gentleman named Ken Winslow. And this was before brain research was really being attended to in the educational world. And he was doing presentations on the impact of neurology on teaching. It was the early days. I was fascinated. I thought it really could inform and transform our practices. So we invited him to Hawaii. And like a lot of people, they were interested in coming to Hawaii. So we had him come out to Punahou, and he spoke to our faculty on a professional development day. He did a session in the evening for parents. And it was the first indication of how interested parents were in this whole topic of the neurology of learning. And in many ways, I think it confirmed what parents felt and knew about how their children learned, but it added science to it. So since then, I actually started to go in the summer. Albuquerque Academy in Albuquerque, New Mexico was conducting a small seminar in the summers around the neurology of learning. So I went and we really replicated the model on what I saw at Albuquerque Academy. It was a smaller conference. We had access to the speakers. We got to know the other attendees. And so I saw a gentleman, Frank Cross, from the Upside Down organization, and it's a consortium out of Baltimore that runs a series of schools, but applies brain research to their whole educational model. So again, we invited Frank out to what was our first Brain Symposium.
Do you remember the turnout of the first symposium?
You know, we actually were in the hundreds, and during the day, I think that first year we pushed 250, maybe 300. For this reason, we made a decision to open it up to public school educators at no or minimal cost. I think we charged $50 the first year. And it was really a way for us to avail our thinking and resources to educators across the state, public or private. And because we had so many public school teachers attend, again, we knew we were onto something. So it grew from there. So I went back to Albuquerque Academy the next summer. They're no longer holding their event, but that's where I saw Dr. Eagleman. And it turns out he was a distinguished alumni of Albuquerque Academy, and he'd been doing some fascinating research on the neurology of learning and written several books. A very engaging speaker, wonderful guy. So we invited him out. He's traveling all over the world. I think we got him on his way back from London, but he hosted our second Brain Symposium. And again, we had great turnout from both public and private educators. We were absorbing most of the costs at that time, but it was really a way for us to make a contribution to the community. So the third year, we decided to swing for the fences, and we invited Dr. John Medina, who had written the book Brain Rules.
I see.
And he agreed to come. He asked us who our other speakers had been, and I think by then we'd built some credibility for the event.
Right.
And he was absolutely amazing. I think all the speakers have been. But Dr. Medina, I mean, he's a researcher in the truest sense, but he's a storyteller, and he's engaging, and he's pragmatic. If you've read his book, you can see how he applies what he knows about how the brain, how we learn. But that book, actually, I recommended it to parents in all of our parent talks at the beginning of the year. And I've never had a book, ever, where throughout the school year I had so many parents stop me and say, I read Brain Rules, it was amazing, it helped me, I understand my child better. And it's just really grown from there. So we had Dan Siegel and now Carol Dweck this year.
Now, do you notice that you've done this symposium for 5 years? Do you feel that the criteria you use to seek out a keynote speaker has changed?
I think as we read and as we learn, each of the speakers has had a different area of emphasis. What we're trying to do is, and what's happening in the field of education, is that for decades, the neurologists have been uncovering amazing new learnings and understanding about the brain. But the practical application of that to the classroom was fragmented, and we're trying to build the bridge between what the researchers are discovering in their laboratories and what the practitioners are doing in the classrooms. And that's really our goal, and that's really what determines who we invite out.
You brought up the point of translating research to applying the research to classroom. Tell me about this year's symposium and the work of Dr. Carol Dweck. Of course, in that newspaper article that I read, it was a very quick overview of the fixed and growth mindset. Could you elaborate on that?
We actually have been talking about her book, Mindsets, for several years at school. Our faculty have read it, we've recommended it to the parents. And her research originated with studies with fifth graders. She is a researcher in the truest sense, and the research she does, she manages controlled variables. Her metrics are meticulously managed, and as a result of that, she can generalize her results. So what she did in her initial study, she worked with fifth graders, and she gave 2 groups of students various tasks. She gave them a puzzle, and when they turned in the puzzle, she said to one group, she said, "Oh, you did very well. You must be smart." And the other group, she said, "Oh, you did well. You must have worked hard." And then what she measured is the likeliness of how they would respond to a subsequent task. And what she found is the group that they had told that, "Oh, you did well because you're smart," they were less likely to take on another task. Versus the group who had been told you did well because you must have worked hard, they were much more likely to take on a hard task.
So why is that the case? I know that there's a difference. You praise the child, and the child recognizes that maybe he or she is intelligent, and then the other one is focusing on the effort. So what's the difference there?
So if we tell a child, "Oh, you've done well because you're smart," we've set up the mental model that intelligence is innate. And therefore, if I take on a more challenging task, I potentially am threatening my perception that my intelligence is innate, and I don't want to threaten that. Versus, if I believe that success is not an innate quality, but really is as a result of my efforts. So if I take on a challenging task, it is my effort that can carry me through to success. And what we want children to perceive is its effort is the determinant of what we can accomplish. So she then went on to elaborate on the characteristics of fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets. And children and adults with more growth mindsets approach challenges differently, approach failures and setbacks differently, approach collaboration differently.
Now, let's talk about the adult learning later on, but earlier on you mentioned that Dr. Dweck's research is with very focused group. And you mentioned that sometimes with application it's more difficult to replicate. So how do you inculcate this kind of work ethics to get children to work hard to achieve something, especially in this day and age when instant gratification is what is expected?
I think I think what you're describing, and potentially in the form of a concern about a generation of children, reinforces the importance of cultivating what Dr. Duet describes as a growth mindset. I mean, we want children to learn that it is effort, that it's persistence, that it's resilience. There's a book written by Paul Tuck, and his research, and we've shared this with our parents, talks about the importance of, he talks about qualities of character, resilience, persistence, but one in particular stands out. It's called grit. And he talks about the importance, particularly now, of teaching a generation of children, not that you teach grit, but that you give them opportunities to acquire characteristics of grit, which would mean just that ability to stick with something when faced with obstacles.
So as an educator and as the principal at Punahou, how do you do that with your children there?
You know, we had a chance to talk earlier about the role of failure in our school system, and there are educators across the country wrestling with this whole notion of failure. We've been working with design thinkers. We've done a project with IDEO, and more specifically worked with a firm out of San Francisco, Daylight Design. And a lot of things fascinate me about design thinkers, but the thing that fascinates me the most is their whole entrepreneurial mindset, but their comfort level with failure. And when you work with design thinkers, they'll push you and they'll say, oh, if you haven't failed multiple times, you're not pushing hard enough, you're not stretching your thinking enough. So I do question if we are giving our children enough opportunity to experience failure, not in terms of catastrophic failure, but failure in the terms of, let me push an idea so far that it's challenged. And what happens is if most things that we do in education is high stakes, that I've got to have this pristine transcript or this pristine resume that will get me into the college of choice, then that's a different framework of risk. I saw a student do a project just a couple of weeks ago, and his goal was to build a handmade airplane that could fly. Okay. And he started with balsa, and he ended up migrating to styrofoam, and he initially had the engine on the front, and it pulled the aircraft into the ground, and he moved to the back, and he made this amazing video. But the whole video was about what he learned through failure. And the whole lesson was, he says, I learned so much from modifying what was perceived as failures. And he wasn't discouraged, he was only motivated. He didn't know anything about growth mindset, but as I watched that boy, I said, that is an example of a growth mindset.
But I'm wondering if perhaps this student is, he has the propensity, he has the characteristics to take failures, but I guess in our education system right now, so much at stake. How do you actually teach or share with children that, okay, failing is okay? Because as a mom, I know that, okay, when my son fails, I try not to, it can be very discouraging, but as a parent, I think, okay, you know what, he can learn, but then I don't think this system supports that. So in some way, there's a dichotomy there. So how do you explain that to young people?
I first of all don't start with the assumption that we have the shared understanding about what failure is. So even before we launch into the role or the value of failure in a school, probably having some discussion about, well, what constitutes failure? And you know, a design thinker or an entrepreneur said failure was this opportunity to learn, that I pushed a prototype, that I finally was able to refine a prototype because I learned how it wouldn't work. That's one notion of failure. Another failure is you got an 82 as opposed to a 92 on a test. So you know that I'm interested in neurology. Well, I know that neurologically those two scenarios are releasing different chemicals in the brain. Okay. One more about dopamine, one more about cortisol.
Okay.
So here's what I'm coming to understand. I'm glad you chuckled.
Yeah, because how does this work? I mean, it's like the analogy would be, okay, I know how to drive, but it doesn't matter for me how the car works, but obviously you know the mechanics as well as the results. So yes, please explain.
So let's take that example that when you're driving, most of what you're doing is just habitual, that you make left-hand turns. Now, we're not going to talk about failure like, well, I learned because I had the failure and backed my car into a wall. That's not a good example.
Right.
But here's what happens. The brain seeks out novelty. And neurologically, the opportunities for learning occur in the moment of failure. So what happens is this. The brain, when it is initially learning something new, is incredibly stimulated. But that then after time, it starts to become routine. And you know that feeling when you learn something and it just innately feels satisfying? That's because your brain's getting these bursts of dopamine. There's not a thing that we do that's not motivated by releases of dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pleasure. So what happens is when you've done something, if you've performed a mathematical function over and over again and you can do it successfully, the routine of it starts to release the dopamine. And then as soon as you experience failure, a variable's changed and you don't get the outcome, your brain, boom, is looking for dopamine. And therein lies the opportunity to learn. So in education, we talk about teachable moments. That moment where your brain is searching for the dopamine is what's happening neurologically, and that is a teachable moment.
But then I presume this release of dopamine, it's not the same for every child.
Yeah.
So how do you design a curriculum that would help or maximize the release of dopamine for all the children?
So that leads us to the question of personalization.
Okay.
So I believe that a potential next frontier in education will be schools that figure out how to personalize the instructional experience. Therein lies my concern about curricular models that overly standardize the instructional experience. I understand that is often done in the interest of equality, that it is through standardization that we can ensure more equality of educational experience. But also the whole notion of celebrating our individuality. And so I do believe the schools of the future that will be the most effective are those schools that can figure out how to leverage available technologies to better personalize the instructional experience. And it is the recognition that children learn differently, that they learn at different rates, that there are gaps and leaps in their cognitive development, and how can teachers personalize the experience and adjust it on a relatively manageable basis to meet the needs of an individual child.
I'd love to see that happen, but of course the question that I immediately think about is the resources. I guess bringing it back to reality, there are perhaps schools that are perhaps more amenable and they have the resources to develop this type of personalized curriculum. But perhaps other schools cannot do that. So how do we deal with these variables here?
So I think, yes, on the one hand, it is a question of resources. So we can do the research and find some very innovative examples of people developing technologies and curriculums that can be personalized, and the technology is such that at a point it will be cost effective. At the same time, the MOCCs, look at what's happening particularly in higher education.
Can you define MOCC for our audience?
The mass online communities of learning. So, I mean, Stanford and numerous universities are making their curriculums available on a mass scale. And that is an example of personalizing the learning because you can pursue interests of your choice. So there's an economy of scale in that the technology makes it deliverable and efficient. So I think your point is well taken, that we're not at a point yet where we have the technologies developed to personalize, but there are good examples emerging, and should we look at that in the next 3 to 5 years? Absolutely. And I think that that's the challenge for independent schools right now. I mean, the whole study of the financial modeling of independent schools, something that we did research on in our doctoral program, it calls into question the financial model that independent schools have existed in for decades. And there's questions of if that model is viable going forward. And the solution lies in some of these alternative forms of delivery.
That's fascinating. So are these some of the topics that you talk about in your 2-day forum at the Brain Symposium then?
The Brain Symposium focuses more specifically on the neurology of learning. So this year, Carol Dweck, day one, focused on growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Day two, I did a seminar that is really the topic of my dissertation, which is on the neurology of decision making. And it is how you can apply research on decision making to strategic planning. And that research was about developing a tool, a matrices that could be used in schools to make programmatic decisions to ensure that the allocation of resources are best leveraged.
That's great. Mike, why don't we take a break? So when we come back, maybe you can share with us a little bit more about how the discussions that you've had at the Brain Symposium, how you translate to some of the really creative and innovative curriculum that you're implementing at Punahou School. My guest is Mike Walker, principal of junior school at Punahou School. We'll talk some more after the break.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
Of practical applications.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, my guest is Mike Walker, junior school principal at Punahou School. Our conversation has been about brain research and how it has propelled advances in teaching. Mike, before the break, we were talking about neuroscience and personalizing instructions. And at the Brain Symposium, you've done it for 5 years. Tell us how you're able to translate some of the concepts into actual practical application to the curriculum at Punahou School.
Yeah. That was actually where Dr. John Medina was most helpful because, for example, we were in the midst of creating interdisciplinary curriculum in our middle school. And I think he helped us understand that creating a curriculum in which all of the disciplines of learning are interconnected is consistent with how the brain neurologically organizes and retrieves information. So our argument then is that an interdisciplinary curriculum is actually more compatible with the brain's preference for forming strong neural networks. So as opposed to isolating science from math, from literature and social studies, how can we craft a curriculum that teaches students to use all of those disciplines of learning in the study of a problem or question? Another example, so this summer we're reading a book called A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger. And he acknowledges that he snatched that title from a Cummings poem. And it actually is written as much for businesses as it is for schools. But the reason his book resonated with me and why we're reading it as a faculty is he establishes the neurological basis for asking questions. And so what we're trying to do there is create a whole inquiry-based curriculum. A curriculum starts with a question, and creates room in the curriculum for student-generated questions to guide the course of study.
Okay, let me ask you this question then. For a very traditional system that we are familiar with, you have one or two right answers. I guess I've never been taught how to ask questions, and how far have we come along, and is this something new?
You know, one of the premises of it, and I think the responsibility I feel for our children and the next generation, is that the complexity of the problems that they will face and be challenged to solve in their adult lives are different than the problems that we're facing. So consequently, the complexity of those problems will require them to be able to think differently, which will mean ask a different level of questions, to think from multiple disciplines simultaneously. So the validation for me of creating an inquiry-based interdisciplinary curriculum is how we need to prepare students for the problems they'll face. The research, the neurological research, supports creating a curriculum in that model.
So how long ago did you implement this inquiry-based curriculum then?
You know, we sort of backed into it in that a decade ago when we were working on the middle school, this neurological research was really starting to transform our understanding of how children's brains developed. And what was changing is there were things that we used to think was true about the development of the adolescent brain that as recently as 10 years ago changed. I mean, when I was a young teacher, we used to think that the adolescent brain, for all practical purposes, had completed the bulk of its development. And we've only learned, really, in the last 10 to 15 years, that the frontal lobe of the adolescent brain is continuing to develop, which explains a lot of their impulsivity, it explains a lot of their behavior. It's not an excuse, but it explains it neurologically. So there's an educational application of a new neurological understanding. So that's 10 or 15 years ago. We started to then build interdisciplinary curriculum, largely informed by the work of Dr. John Medina. I think we're now better understanding the value of inquiry-based. And so our curriculum now, as of the last year, is being designed around inquiry-based questions. Inquiry-based questions then lend themselves to interdisciplinary studies, because if I ask a broad, open-ended question, I need to tap all the disciplines of learning in order to pursue a question. So the progression would be inquiry-based learning using an interdisciplinary curriculum to address questions of complexity.
Do you see any difference in the performance or even performance of the students for those, especially those who have gone through this type of newer inquiry-based curriculum as opposed to perhaps the more traditional ones?
Yeah. You know, it's funny that a lot of these ideas we might think that they're sort of dangerously progressive. Ironically, I was trained in inquiry curriculum 30 years ago.
Oh.
So inquiry curriculum in and of itself is not a new model. What is different now is the neurological studies behind it that really start to inform and validate the approach. For example, an open-ended inquiry-based question comes from a different part of the brain than does a question that's looking for a specific predetermined answer. And it has to do, one comes more from the right hemisphere, the other comes more from the left hemisphere. And Warrenberger cites the research that references that. So giving students the opportunity and practice in asking inquiry-based questions literally, physiologically, neurologically takes them to a different part of their brain. And he talks not only about educational applications, but he talks about business applications of this as well.
I'm trying to hold off asking the business implications. So let me ask you two questions. Well, the two questions I'd like to ask. You just mentioned in passing that you were actually taught with an inquiry-based curriculum long time ago,
right? And
it's not new. What happened to it? Why did it fall out of grace, if I could use that expression?
You know, the pendulum of educational models. And so I was fortunate enough to be trained in an educational program that was more progressive in nature, The first school that I taught at happened to be the American School Foundation in Mexico City, and the social studies curriculum was all delivered through inquiry-based method. And it's really just the difference between inductive versus deductive thinking.
Which means?
So deductive thinking, do you start with sort of a broad perspective and then move towards your conclusions? So for example, I used to teach US history, but we didn't start with the facts and the dates. What we actually started with was questions. And it's really applying the scientific method to the social sciences. So you start out with the hypotheses, a broad-based question, that we would then go through the process of reading primary sources, and at the end drawing conclusions. But that's much different from a traditional model in which I'm going to teach you this set of 20 facts, at which point I will evaluate you a week later to see how much of it you've retained. John Medina cites the studies of how much we will retain. The truth of the matter is, just because this conversation is verbal, you will probably retain less than 15% of it at the end of it, unless we were to engage you differently.
Well, that would be a different conversation here. Now, you also mentioned that you use different parts of the brain. So my question has to do with the gender difference, because I guess for women we use certain parts of the brain more than guys do. So would an inquiry-based curriculum work better for?
Yeah, so the gender differences and the learning differences around gender, fascinating studies, and like lots of complex topics, you'll find research on both sides. 5 or 6 years ago, there's Michael Gurian is an author, writer who talks a lot about neurological gender differences. He has been controversial of late because there's emerging research that suggests that the differences aren't as significant as he seems to indicate. For example, has to do with the thickness of the corpus callosum that determines how you can use the 2 lobes of the brain. I think the where I go with that is the recognition, I broaden it to say that, you know what, all children learn differently. And it is the recognition that if I'm sitting in a class in front of 25 students, I embrace, regardless of gender, that they're all learning differently. And my skill as a teacher is to recognize, the ability to recognize what each individual child needs and how they best respond to learning.
Now that's a gender question. Then the cultural one, because I know that there are international teachers who came to the Brain Symposium, and we had talked about that. There was the Song-Ching Ling Foundation. Could you share with the audience why they're interested in what you're doing at Punahou School?
They're very interested in what we're doing in Punahou School, and so in addition to the Song-Ching Ling Foundation and their schools, we have partnerships with schools around the world, China included, Japan, Indonesia, but in particular several schools in China, and they have sent groups of teachers over through our Wo International Center. And I think they're trying to find a way out of the overly rigid, standardized instructional model. And not that you abandon it, but they're curious about a curriculum that fosters innovation and the potential to find multiple solutions to complex problems. So they were very interested. We did a presentation on our thinking about the neurology of learning, and I was fortunate. I was invited to go back several summers ago and gave a series of talks on the neurology of learning and how we're using our understanding of the neurology of learning to inform our strategic planning. They were very, very interested in that, and they subsequently have sent teachers back every year. They've studied extensively our curricular model up at the K1, the Omidi or K1 neighborhood, spent times in our classrooms. As a matter of fact, they've had 2 of their administrators spend up to 6 months with us this year.
Do you know how well they are implementing different curriculum in their own school?
You know, I thoroughly enjoyed my visit to the Song-Ching Ling Foundation schools, and they have a campus in Shanghai and then another campus outside, and not in any way a traditional Chinese school. And their hallways are full of art, and their children are actively and creatively engaged. They have 2 tracks in the school. They have the international track, and then they have the traditional. but they clearly understand and embrace the element of the creative expression. I found the schools to not only be fascinating, but highly creative, and the children wonderful. They were thoroughly enjoyable visits.
So is this partnership or relationship continuing then?
As a matter of fact, they are sending students over this summer to participate in some of our summer school programs. We're looking at potentially have some of their middle school students come back in the fall. And we have similar relationships. Tamagawa schools in Japan have been sending students here, and we send our students over as exchange as well. I think it benefits everybody.
Well, I have to admit that I didn't know anything about the Song Ching-ling Foundation and the things that the innovative approach that they are taking to some of their schools. So it's good to know that even though China, well, you hear about the education system, but they're trying to find a different way to teach the next generation. Mike, we're coming to another break, so we'll continue our conversation, and perhaps in our next segment I can ask you about how this brain research applies to business and I guess vice versa. My guest is Mike Walker, Junior School Principal at Punahou School. We'll talk some more when we get back.
Aloha, I'm Carlos Juarez, host of our show Global Connections here in the ThinkTech Hawaii series. And Global Connections, of course, very important because we live in a world that is increasingly interdependent. We bring global issues here to the table. We bring people, informed subject matter experts. We also underscore how important Hawaii is to the world, people who are making the difference in the world here. As you've seen from some of our shows, we bring experts, and joining us for today's show as an example, Patrick Branco, a U.S. diplomat who's from Kailua, grew up here and is now helping bring aloha to the world of diplomacy. Patrick, thank you again for joining us here on Global Connections, a show that helps keep us connected to the world. Anything you can add for us?
Yeah, it's great to be here. This is my second time on the show, and it's great to always talk about global issues, but in a Hawaii context,
Excellent.
which is always wonderful.
Yeah, so stay tuned. Global Connections, part of our ThinkTech series. Aloha.
Welcome back. This is ThinkTech Hawaii BizEd Spotlight. My name is Alice Li Hagen. My guest is Mike Walker, Junior School Principal at the Punahou School. We were talking about brain research, the Brain Symposium that recently ended at the Punahou School. Mike, before the break, we were talking about the international interest in what Punahou School is doing. Let's come back to your school and talk about, well, you've had a very successful 5th annual symposium. What do you hope to achieve or accomplish in this upcoming year?
I think our goal constantly is to broaden our understanding of how not only children, but quite frankly, adults learn. I think a benefit and an outcome of the Brain Symposium is not only has it helped us as educators better understand how our children learn, but quite frankly, I think it's helped us understand how we learn, and how even as adults we need to continue to be learners ourselves.
Well, I know you're constantly learning, and because you're pursuing your doctorate program too, so you have to keep reading. And I know earlier on you make a lot of references to business practice. You read a lot of books that pertain to different aspects of business. So how did this all happen? Why are you reading so much about business, and how does it actually apply to your role as an educator?
Mm-hmm. You know, we had a chance to chat earlier about systems thinking, and so Senge's work, the 5th discipline, but he has a book called Schools That Learn, and it's taking systems thinking and applying it to educational institutions. So I think that schools have a lot to learn from business models, but frankly, it's my fascination with entrepreneurs as well. And what we want to do is cultivate that entrepreneurial spirit in schools. And at the same time, I also think that businesses have a lot to learn about what schools know about learning of adults as well. In Berger's book, he actually has the data and shows the chart of the number of questions 4-year-olds ask and what happens to those questions over time. And the graph is actually startling, and he shows the average, and I'm quoting his numbers off the top of my head, but I think he says that the average 4-year-old asks upward of 4,000 questions in a given period of time. And we know that from our own children when they were young.
Yes.
But the question is, why aren't they asking the same number of questions when they're 10, 11, and 12, 13? And so his question, and a question I share, is our children ask fewer questions, apparently, the longer they stay in school.
And well, why is the case? And I guess we brought that up earlier on. How do you teach them to continue to be curious? I guess that's all it comes down to, right? And I don't want to say that the education system erases that part of their ability to ask questions, because maturity takes over and people do become curious. And I know people like that too. But how do you train that? And let me.
I started my career teaching in high school, and then at Punahou for the past 16 years, I've been working K-8, and I've been in 4 K-12 schools. One of the things I love about kindergartners and the obligation that I feel as an educator is those kindergartners, what I love about them is they come to us intrinsically curious. And I think our obligation as educators is that upon graduation, they need to leave us equally, if not more, curious. So it is at every step along the way, giving children opportunity to pursue questions of their interest. So here's an example, and you asked me about engagement. One of our 8th grade teachers, when we were talking about this whole inquiry model, she Googleized her curriculum. What that basically meant, you know how Google allows their employees to spend 20% of their time pursuing interests, and I've heard that they're doing a little bit less of that. But she took 20% of her curriculum. Now she teaches civics, government class, good solid curriculum, but she allowed for 20% of the curriculum for the students to pursue a question of their interest. And the quality of their work, the level of engagement was extraordinary. And they picked topics of substance. Their presentations, which I went to see, were amazing. But the point was something was triggered differently in their brain. So the answer is, we don't have to abandon what we're doing, but can we increasingly create more room in our curriculum to give children the experience to pursue that kind of inquiry?
Now, it's not only with curriculum. You were talking about how we can, as adults, learn that way too, to be constantly asking questions. So how would you apply that to a business setting? Because in a lot of organizations, professional development, training, that's something that's required. So how can we do it more effectively?
Berger's book is excellent, and he talks first and foremost about creating an ethos in an organization that not only tolerates but invites questions. And his case studies are mostly examples from business and how organizations, businesses, or markets created because somebody within an organization had the conviction or the inclination to ask a question and then pursue it.
Now, asking questions is related to being curious, and I guess these are really qualities that an entrepreneur possesses. Earlier on, we were talking about how do you teach entrepreneurialism among little ones.
Yeah. I say this fondly, but we also know that people that ask questions can sometimes be irritating.
Yes, depends on the type of questions. You're absolutely
it
right.
does, and so it can be that element of peskiness to it, and I mean maybe qualities that have been attributed to me over the years. So what Berger talks about is, can an organization, can a company create a climate in which questions are encouraged and invited, and then seeing how a corporation responds to that. And that's what I love about the design thinkers, is they have systems for managing a multitude of questions and then a process to refine and surface the best questions. That's the value of design thinking, and design thinking is a business model.
You work with design thinking. Do you know of other schools that are doing this, something similar?
There are other schools now, but I think frankly what the design thinkers, the IDEO Corporation, Daylight Design, as a matter of fact, IDEO has come up with a handbook for educators, and what they're really interested in doing is applying the design thinking model to curriculum. If I was a classroom teacher right now, I would deliver my curriculum through design thinking.
So how different would it look compared to what the type of curriculum we know about right now?
Dramatically. You would walk into a classroom and as opposed to seeing students in rows, predominantly passive, directed towards a teacher delivering instruction, you would see dynamic levels of inventiveness and engagement in students prototyping and researching and interacting. Design thinking is substantive and design thinking is rigorous, and you have to be an excellent communicator and calculator, but it's engagement at its most vital and vibrant level.
If you're able to implement a curriculum, a design thinking curriculum, what role would a teacher, a traditional teacher, play?
A much different role. It's a good question. And I think that that's part of what we're accustomed to. So if what's changed because of technology and because of whole, teachers used to be the source of information. What a teacher knew is what they dispensed. Well, now because of technologies, we have access to the content. So the teacher becomes that guide and facilitator and helps the students make the connections.
Then it goes back to the training. So how would you train teachers differently then?
It is a different orientation, and that in large part is what's motivated the Brain Symposium. It is giving teachers access to the researchers so that we can translate their research into educational practice, and that's the essence of what we're trying to do.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, I was asking you, so what are you hoping to achieve for the next year? But you've also done the Brain Symposium for 5 years, and you mentioned that there are public school educators, educators across, in Oahu who come. If there are two things that you want to share with them, what would they be?
Here's a new model that we actually tried this year around Carol Dweck's work, and it challenged the assumption that when you bring a speaker, we listen to their theory, and then we assume that something comes from it. And that's the typical model of conferences, applied to business conferences and educational conferences. What we did this year, we actually assembled a group of teachers. We called ourselves the Mindset Mentors. And we actually met throughout the year in preparation for Dr. Dweck's visit. And not only did they help me plan the Brain Symposium, but we were thinking about research models in which we could, after her visit next year, actually implement her theory and then gather some measurements to see, are we actually cultivating a growth mindset in our classrooms, and ask ourselves questions like, what language am I using in my classroom that cultivates a growth mindset? Or looking at, for example, how am I assessing my students? And does my system of assessment encourage or discourage a growth mindset? So what we made the commitment to do is, not only in preparation for her visit, but after her visit, collect research and data to see how effectively we're implementing her theory. That's a new model for us.
Wow. So does that mean you may have a session to review all the research, the data that you have collected for next year?
So we have a group of 10 to 20 teachers right now, some working in smaller groups, some working in teams. And what they will be doing next year is following up on Dr. Dweck's visit, collecting data on levels of student engagement, examples of growth versus fixed mindset. And the parents are interested. We held the evening session for parents this year, and Dillingham Hall, as a result of the article that you read, was overflowing. And that just shows you how interested parents. And then your question about a business example. If I'm a business leader, do I not want to cultivate a growth mindset in my employees who will respond to challenges? Dr. Dweck talked about embracing struggle as an opportunity to cultivate a growth mindset. So there's clear business applications of the growth mindset.
That's really fascinating, because I'm thinking, okay, right now your Brain Symposium, most of your participants are educators, but I guess I read that there are some business people coming. Do you think you can replicate it for the business community?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, we can. And I think that that's actually a good... I would like to see schools become more entrepreneurial And I think businesses would benefit from what we know and understand about how people learn. And I think that therein lies a perfect opportunity for partnership.
Are there like-minded people out there who may be interested in working with you? Do you know?
After they see this webcast, there will hopefully be droves.
That would be great. I hope so. Now, I guess let's see. I lost my train of thought. Last question for you. I know you just ended the symposium. Now, besides this data collection that you are talking about, anything else that you may have in mind for the next symposium, something different?
You know, it's an example of how we learn from the design thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the design thinkers talk about non-precious prototypes. And it took us a while to get used to that, because I realized how we were accustomed to precious prototypes, that when we create something, it becomes precious to us. It's like we built a sculpture out of marble and we don't want to tinker with it. So we've gotten more comfortable with non-precious prototypes. So the Brain Symposium, what we're doing now is pulling back and saying what worked, what did we like, what do we want to modify. We're thinking about future speakers, but we're thinking about future models. We learned a lot from this group of mindset mentors, that we have faculty that spend time around a common interest. This is a group of K-12 faculty that are very busy, that came to this because they were interested on their own time. That tells me something. So what we're doing right now is looking at a non-precious prototype and then making the modifications for what we decide to do in the next year.
That's great. Well, I hope you will have some time to enjoy your summer. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and of course to learn about all the innovative approaches to education and all the significant impact that neuroscience research has on education. I wish you all the best with your doctorate. I know that you're going to England
Next week.
next week. So all the best, and thank you for coming to the show, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
My guest is Mike Walker. He is the principal at Punahou School for the junior school. He also spearheaded the Brain Symposium at the school. Thanks for joining us here at BizEd Spotlight ThinkTech Hawaii. We'll see you next week.